nevertheless.
And
Want it all.
So our lesson
Well,
tonight.
our topic title is nevertheless, and you'd be surprised how many times you hear that, right, when people are talking nevertheless, but really what it means, nevertheless, means moreover, so more, exceed more in quantity, abundant, much greater, major portion, above and beyond. And we just say it, in a sentence. But really it's saying, but nevertheless, never settle for the less. How many of you want God's highest and best for you? And I'm not talking about a bunch of material things, but you want God's plan. You want the highest and best that God has for you. If that is you, start throwing those hearts up. Let it be known that's what you want. We don't want to be mediocre, right? We don't want to just be in the condition of poor or average. And I'm not talking even monetary. I'm just saying, like, we want our life we want it to be God's highest and best for us.
Here, the bottom line is this, is that when we leave this walk of life, I want to leave knowing that I've fulfilled everything that He's asked me to do.
Right.
And so being the best I can be for Christ.
Well, He's got so much more. There is so much more than we are experiencing, but we have to be expecting and looking for it. So you never settle for less than God's highest and best. God has far more than we are experiencing. Once again, so it's just believing Him for it. And sometimes we don't believe Him for more because we're afraid we'll be disappointed. Isn't that right? And disappointed means to be discouraged by the failure of one's hopes and expectations. And so sometimes we don't set it, or we don't aim high because we don't want to be disappointed. That's our mindset, instead of taking faith, right, and believing Him.
We need to be careful that, when you have expectations, you want to make sure that your expectations are in the will of God. What I'm saying is that this is what God has for your life. I don't want to be something God didn't call me to be, because I'll be miserable.
Right.
But if we can be what God called us to be and experience what He has for us without shirking back from it or drawing away from it, I'm telling you, that makes for a fulfilled life.
When you said that, it reminded me many years ago when we were on the evangelistic field. We're obviously pastors now, but you got a phone call from, it was a place out of Florida that asked if you would pastor a church, and it said you wouldn't want for anything, house and cars and whatever, But Rick said he said I would be miserable and you would be miserable, because it's not what God called him to do. It wasn't time to pastor then.
Right.
That was what God had for us to do, was evangelizing. And
Right. Well, and I didn't think I'd ever pastor. I didn't,
Exactly.
But I knew. I said if God, if I'm not saying I never will. I said, but if God calls me to do that, He'll let me know. He'll rewire me, and that's what He did. He let me know, and at that point, it wasn't about money and houses and lands and all that stuff. You understand? There's something about doing what God's asked you to do that can bring great contentment.
So Luke 18:7, and if you'll set this up, this is...
Well, this is the story of where the woman has, she's got an adversary, and she keeps going. Somebody's ripped her off. I'm just going to put it in plain English. Somebody's cheated her, done something. And so she keeps going to this judge. Now, this judge is a hardcore judge, man. He doesn't fear God. This is what Scripture says about it. He doesn't fear God. He doesn't fear man. He just doesn't care. But this woman is about to wear him out, man. She keeps coming, and he finally says, look, I don't fear God, and I don't fear man, but this woman's getting on my nerves. Said, I'm going to give her what she's asking for. She's about to wear me out. And so he said, hear what the unjust judge said. He said, now don't you think God in heaven is going to answer your prayer, though you call out to Him night and day? He's saying, look, if an unrighteous man, if a judge that doesn't care anything about you and doesn't fear God could be persuaded by a continual asking, he said, don't you know that your Father that loves you, when you ask Him, He's going to give you those things that you're asking for though he tarry long. See, sometimes it's not just that we want it now. You understand what I'm talking about? It's like we're not just asking God, we're trying to put God on a time frame.
So here was the verse. He said, and shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them? He said, I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, shall he find faith on the earth?
So what's he saying? He's asking, do you have the faith to believe that God will
do anything?
Will do what you're asking.
So Matthew 7:7 says, ask and it shall be given to you. Seek and you shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asks receives, and he that seeks finds, and to him that knocks it shall be opened. And so what he's saying is a lot of times we have not because we ask not, and we haven't set our sights high. We haven't aimed high. And so you had mentioned this the other night about, we were speaking about the mantle, the mantle
with
of
Elijah
success
and Elisha.
with Elijah and Elisha. And so when it was time for Elijah to go, he was being carried off into heaven.
Elisha would not settle for less.
Right.
He kept following Elijah. He served him. He took on the role of a servant. He was humble. And finally, Elijah looked at him and said, what is it you want me to do before I go? And he said, I want a double portion of your spirit. And he looked at him and he said, buddy, you've asked for well, he didn't say the buddy part, but he said, you've asked for a hard thing. He said, nevertheless, if you see me, what he's saying is this, I can't impart that to you. But if you see me when I'm taken, then it's going to be yours. And so because Elisha was not willing to settle for less, he ended up receiving that double portion.
Right. So today I was thinking...
Here's our illustration. I have little Debbie with me today.
This is one of my favorites, and I try not to buy them because here's why. Okay, so there's two. There's two in a package. And so if I eat one, I can't just leave.
Nevertheless,
I want the more.
I don't know if you realize this, but you can buy these in single packs.
No, I didn't realize it, and it's a good thing. But what happens, don't open it. Don't open it yet. Because I'm saying if I open this, there's another one in there, and I'm not going to settle for just one of those.
It's like when she opens up a bag of M&M peanuts.
Peanut M&Ms.
That's
anything. A bag of chips. If it's open, I'm in trouble.
She has to. We've got a sealer here at the house now.
A vacuum seal.
I brought a bag of chips in, and she said, "What are you doing bringing that bag of chips?" I said, "Well, I thought we could take it up with us. Seal off a little bag and take it for lunch when we go up to the church with a sandwich." And so I left and I come in and she's got chips in her hand.
I'm picking chips and I got Dorito breath, and then all of a sudden I know he hears, that's our vacuum seal. It's like, I have to seal it up because I want more. Nevertheless. So
it's good to want more when it's more the right thing, right?
Yeah, and we just got off the phone with Leonard, and you've heard us talk about Leonard. He's a man of faith, what you see is what you get, and he will pray that simple childlike prayer, and I'm telling you what, God has done miracles through the childlike faith. But anyway, so he had on his SUV, his window didn't work. It didn't go down. It wouldn't.
Well, what was going on is when he tried to roll his window up, he didn't realize that there was a screw that was caught in the track.
Wasn't it?
And what was happening is it was hitting the car door handle inside the door, and it was opening his door, so he'd be going down the road and try to roll that window up or roll it down either way, and it'd trip that door handle and his door would open up.
So this was 3 years of that. He decided he wasn't settled. It was like, nevertheless. He went and had it looked at, and his air conditioner was messed up that long too.
Well, the air conditioner needed Freon in it, so the man put Freon in his air conditioning, fixed his door.
Yeah, found that there was a screw in the track, like you said. Yeah. And so, but he decided that day, I'm going to get it fixed. I'm not going to settle for less.
But he got it for a lot less than he thought.
Yeah, zero. They didn't charge him anything, but he was just so excited and just giving God praise, and we were rejoicing with him. So, but I think we have to come, well, we do, we have to come to that place of, no, I'm not settling for less.
Yeah, and a lot of times I think
experiencing.
what happens is if we're not careful, we treat God like it's a social event or like it's some type of a club, and we're just fulfilling an obligation. But do you understand that God is real? I mean,
Yes.
he wants to be involved in our lives, but he's not going to force his way into our life. So he gives us a free will, and when we take that free will and say, God, I want more of you, guess what he does? He comes in greater measures.
That's right. We have to want it. You know, I read a story today. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of Andrew Womack. You've probably heard of Womack. But anyway, he told a story about he was after ministering. He brought people up for prayer, and this man came forward and he said, I have a really bad pain in my neck, and he said, I have a terrible time trying to sleep at night. And he said, and then I also have back problems and a sciatic, and man, he started naming off a bunch of things. And so, but he said, but if he can just heal my neck, I can live with the rest. But look, nevertheless, he was settling for less.
Why would you want to live with
Yeah,
the rest?
exactly. And so I liked what Andrew said. He said, well, I understand if we ask God to heal all those things at once, the lights in heaven might dim. And he was like, I'm not sure God could pull that off. In other words, he was saying, why don't you believe him for the more? Why don't you believe him that he will heal all of that?
You know, there's a saying is that shoot for the moon, and if you miss, at least you wind up among the stars.
Right.
And so don't settle for something less than God has for
Well, and he said we also have to recognize that it's all about receiving what God has already done, and not about getting God to do something he has yet to do. You know, yeah. He established that. You know, even on Calvary's cross, Jesus, you know, he bore our iniquities. By his stripes we are healed.
I think about what Job said, because Job's going through this, and if you remember, look, man, Job goes through this for a while. He's asked God. He doesn't understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And it didn't turn around overnight. But when he first started into it, he made his declaration, and he said, though he slay me, yet I'll trust him. I believe God was saying, or that Job was saying, letting the devil know straight up, you need to understand something. If nothing ever changes here, I'm going to serve God. I'm not giving up. I'm not throwing up my hands. I'm not walking away.
Right.
He said, but I'm going to hold on. And he did hold on. He appealed to God as a judge. And then when God finally answered him, and man, Job is taken back because he didn't realize that the Lord had lifted Job up to Satan. And he said, have you considered my servant Job? He didn't know that. He just thought that his life was in a downward spiral. He didn't know that God was actually honoring him. And so sometimes, that's why the scripture talks about count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, because the trying of our faith is more precious than gold. We don't know what's happening in the spiritual realm, but we know who's in control, and God's got us.
So why don't you talk about Elisha, the king Joash, when he settled for less?
Sometimes we only get partial victories. You understand what I'm saying? We believe God for something and it doesn't quite get to where we want it. And sometimes maybe it's because we don't ask for it up front. So last night we talked about declaration, right? Did we? Or no, we were talking about a mess last night.
The night before that,
we were talking about declaration. So Elisha's nearing the end of his life, and the king of Israel comes to him, and that's Joash at the time, and he's weeping over him because he knows how much Elisha had meant to Israel, and he honored him that way. And Elisha looked at Joash and he said, get your bow and arrows. And he grabs some arrows and he grabs his bow, and then Elisha told him, he said, put your hand upon that bow and draw the arrow back. And he drew the arrow back. Well, he had him open an eastward window, and he drew the arrow back. And then Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. And he said, now shoot the arrow. And when he shot the arrow, he said, this is the arrow of the Lord's deliverance. Then he had the other arrows in his hand, and he said, take those and hit him on the ground. And Joash hits him on the ground 3 times, and he stopped. And Elisha grew angry. And he said, you should have hit those 5 or 6 times. He said, then you would have utterly destroyed Syria. He said, but now you'll only win 3 battles. I thought about how that was linked together. Our actions often determine our victories. How we respond in the middle of turmoil. How we react to God when things are closing in around us. And Elisha had taken him through a symbolic act of warfare, shooting the arrow, shooting the bow, hitting the arrows, but he stopped it 3 times. And he said, man, he said, you should have kept going. Don't settle for the less.
So we aim high. You were talking about how the bullet drops low. We aim high so bullet doesn't have so far to drop.
Debbie was talking to me today about where's that phrase, aim high, come from? Why do they say aim high? And I said it has to do with the journey that the bullet is making. And so the farther away your goal is, or the target is, the higher you aim, because as the bullet travels, it's going to have a natural progression downward. So that's why you see a lot of times these guns that will have these big flip sights, they're high-powered rifles, and on the flip sight, it's got a place where you can measure like for how many hundreds of yards. And they adjust the sight up because then that's where you're aiming. So you're adjusting the sight up high because you know the bullet, by the time it reaches the mark, is going to be at a certain place. And when you go deer hunting, if you're shooting, I've gone deer hunting, and if you're shooting up, you have to be careful that you're not aiming too high, because if you're in a position like this, the bullet's going to have a natural trajectory upward. Or if you're in a tree, you have to be careful that you're not shooting. You can't just shoot at the spot. You have to compensate for the journey. And so here's the thing. Look, the scripture said,
sights, right?
Yeah, Paul makes a statement to the Galatians. He said, you did run well. Who did hinder you? He said, you know, and then he tells us in another place, he said, don't be weary in well-doing, for in due season you're going to reap if you faint not. What's he telling them is this is a race, man. You can't take this like, oh, well, everything's working great today, but if tomorrow brings a problem, then I'm walking off of the track. No, you aim high. You make up your mind, I'm not leaving this race. I'm not moving. I'm not settling for the less. I'm moving forward with God, and I have set my sights high, because I am planning to make it all the way to the end of this journey.
You said this today. If you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I was thinking, he don't know I've got this, but I was cleaning out our armoire in the bedroom, and I found this where he had done some target practicing, and so you set did you raise your sights to get this target?
Here's the problem. It's, if you see that target, you see, I've got some of the bullseyes, but there's others that are scattered around. But that gun was a snub-nosed 38. And so it was very, it was just difficult to aim that gun. I wasn't used to the gun. But then, and let me tie it this way. The more we become familiar with Christ, the more we acquaint ourselves with God, the easier it's going to be for us to hit the mark. It's going to be easier for us to ask God in faith and believe that He's going to do it, because we become acquainted with Him and we see Him work over and over again. How many of you have ever had God heal you or God answer a prayer for you? Throw a thumbs up if you've had that happen. If you've prayed and God has answered your prayer, you've been in a situation and you needed God to do something, and all of a sudden God did that for you. Well, then what happens is the next time we come up against something, we remember, look, he's done it before,
Yes.
he'll do it again.
Yes.
So we don't give up, we don't wimp out, we raise
Nevertheless.
our sights high, and we never settle for less.
Well, talking about aiming high and not missing the mark, sin, the meaning of sin is to miss the mark and not share in the prize. That's what it means, to miss the mark. And so what God is saying is, set those sights high. Don't.
Well, think about what Paul says. Paul, when you just said that, Paul makes a statement, and he said, I press. He said, not as though I'd already attained or were already perfect. He said, but leaving those things that are behind, he said, I press toward the mark of a high calling of God, which is in Christ Jesus, for the prize. So this is what Paul's saying. He's saying, God has set a mark for me.
Yes.
And I'm aiming for that mark. I don't want to miss it. Sin will cause us to miss the mark.
Right. So when you went to Russia, you aimed high, because you were talking about today. You could have asked the chief surgeon.
I ended up in a meeting with a
Surgeon?
Yeah, thank you. His name was Zubkov, and so he came. I took some things there for him from a surgeon in Mississippi. And so he asked me, he said, is there anything that I can do for you? And I thought to myself, I need to aim high. Because I didn't know his connections, and a minister had told me before I went, he said, Rick, he said, just if he asks you, aim high, or not, he didn't say aim high, he said, but go for it, So when he asked me that, I looked at him and I said, yeah, I'd like a meeting. Now, understand, we're in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg has got over 5 million people in it. So I looked at him, I said, well, I'd like a meeting in the mayor's office. This is in St. Petersburg. This is not a little township of 500 people. I said, I'd like a meeting in the mayor's office, and I'd like to have a teacher there, from a public school. And he looks at me and he says, well, let me see what I can do. And he leaves, and I'm thinking, well, now you got to have faith, right? I didn't know what would happen. I shot high.
Nevertheless.
And then when he called me like an hour later, he said, I've got it set up. And I'm telling you, because I aimed high.
Ask what you wanted. Tell what you wanted.
Well, yeah, then I went in, and they said, what is it you want? That, the teacher was there, and they said, what is it you want? I said, I'd like to pass out the Bible in your public schools. And the teacher looked at the coordinator, and the coordinator looked at me, and they said, that would be wonderful. And man, I was shocked. And they said, could you come and teach the Bible in our public school? And I said, that would be wonderful. And so God did exceeding abundantly above what I was able to ask or think.
I remember when I went to Russia with you. Now, you had already gone back and taught the Bible, but then when I went on the trip, there was 40 of us, and we went to hold a meeting in the public school. Well, our interpreter told us, he aimed low, and he said, look, don't expect any emotion because they had been suppressed. And as a matter of fact, when we got there at that point, now it was against the law again to have the Bible in the public school, right? They wouldn't let us pass them out.
Yeah, they would have probably broken up the meeting, so they were not announcing the meeting. They just let a few students know.
But when we began to sing,
and there were about 300 that filled the auditorium.
Right. But when we began to sing and worship God, remember he said, don't expect any response, don't expect any emotion in here. He aimed really low. But nevertheless, look, never settle for less. So, but God did the work. All of a sudden, I remember when it first happened, there was a girl, she looked around and she could feel the presence of God, and she raised her hands. And understand that praise in the Hebrew means the extension of the forearm. She automatically raised her hands, not even knowing why that was happening. And she looked around, and then she took hands with someone else. Before it was over with, that whole school, they had hands raised, and they started moving them back and forth. Yeah. And so God went, because we didn't settle for the less. We just let God have his way, but God did the work.
I looked at Igor, that was the interpreter. I looked at Igor, and I just quizzically, I looked at him and went, and he goes, no ideas. No idea. He couldn't figure out why, but we knew why. because God had showed up on the scene.
Well, I was thinking of the making the mark. You know, remember this was
The making of
the
Mark.
making of Mark, and we were talking about nevertheless and setting our aim high. But I thought about Barnabas today, how that the making of Mark, you know, when you set it high and you want God's highest and best for somebody else, that goes beyond your target, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When you're reaching out to somebody else, and that's exactly what Barnabas was doing with Mark.
Some people may not be aware of the story of Mark and how this came about. Mark was a young man, but he was related to Barnabas.
His uncle,
it was
right?
his nephew, I believe.
Okay,
Yeah, Barnabas was his uncle. And so he and Paul, Barnabas and Paul, took Mark with them on a missionary journey. And in the middle of that, Mark leaves. I think he may have gotten frightened or nervous. I mean, he watches Paul, you know, speak over this guy, and the guy goes blind, man.
Because he was a sorcerer.
Yeah, the guy was trying to intimidate Paul. He was trying to keep this ruler, this man in authority, from coming to Christ. And so Paul lays it on the line. Right after that, Mark leaves. So later, when they finished that journey and they went back to Jerusalem and Mark was there, they get ready to go out again, and Barnabas wants to take Mark, and Paul says no. And it got the conversation got so hot that Paul and Barnabas ended up separating. They still loved each other, but their work together was finished. Paul took Silas and went on out, and Barnabas took Mark because he still believed in Mark.
Yes.
Paul had written Mark off. Hey, I don't want him going with us, but Barnabas held on to Mark. He would not settle for the less for that young man's life.
Yes.
The unique thing about this story is at the end, when you start reading Paul's writings, at the end, he says, send Mark to me because he's profitable for me. And so Paul didn't see something in that young man that Barnabas did. And because he wasn't willing to let him go, it ended up being a blessing. And Mark ended up being a blessing in Paul's life toward the end of his life.
Yeah.
And he writes the first gospel.
Isn't that great? Well, I want you to finish it up with this story, the man that went on a cruise and was settling for less.
I'm sure some of you have heard this story in some form or fashion, but a man purchased a ticket on a cruise, and he could barely afford the ticket, and he got the ticket, and he got on the cruise, and he had packed cheese and crackers, and every night he'd see these dining tables set out with the finest of food, and just, I mean, it was almost more than he could take, and he was eating the cheese and crackers that he brought, and he thought, man, I wish I could afford that food. And the last night of the cruise, one of the attendants spotted him, and they said, what are you doing? Why aren't you eating? He said, I don't have money to afford that. He said, what do you mean money? He said, the food was included in the purchase price of the ticket. He had spent that whole cruise eating cheese and crackers when he could have been feasting on the finest cuisine he'd ever seen before. Sometimes that's what we do, isn't it? We settle for less. We don't realize that God has so much more for us than we're experiencing.
Yes.
And we sit in our corner and we feed on crumbs when he's telling us you can have the whole loaf. Jesus is that bread of life, and he wants us to experience him to the fullest.
One of our favorite scriptures, I'm sure it is yours as well, Ephesians 3:20. Now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. It's God's highest and best for us. He's waiting for us to ask.
Amen.
And
You got to let it work in you.
that's right.
Let's pray together. Father, we're thankful that you don't want us to settle for the less. Father, that you've prepared a way for us.
Yes, God.
You told us in Jeremiah that you know what your thoughts are toward us, and the thoughts of good and not of evil, to give us hope and an expected end. God, you want the very best in our lives. Father, I just pray tonight that our faith come in agreement with your word.
Yes, Jesus.
And we stand and declare that we will not settle for the less, but we will be what you've called us to be and have what you desire for us to have.
Amen.
We thank you for that in Jesus'
Amen.
name. Amen.
Amen.
Love you guys. Hope to see you Sunday. And one of the services 8:30 and 10 o'clock.
But we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow night.
Yeah, we'll be with you again. All right.
Okay, love
Be
you guys.
safe. Love you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.